Somewhere outside Hefei, China, a machine just solved a problem in seconds that would take the world's fastest supercomputer longer than the age of the universe to finish. Somewhere outside New York, American engineers are racing to make sure that machine never has the upper hand for long. This is the quantum data center race, and almost nobody is talking about it. For years, the phrase arms race got attached to almost everything in technology: chips, artificial intelligence, satellites. But there is a new frontier opening up right now, quietly, behind reinforced walls and refrigerated chambers colder than deep space, and it may end up mattering more than all of them combined. It is the race to build the physical infrastructure that will house the next generation of computing power, not server racks stacked with graphics cards, not sprawling warehouses full of humming fans, something stranger, something that looks less like a data center and more like a physics laboratory crossed with a bank vault. Welcome to the world of quantum data centers, and welcome to the two nations sprinting to build them first, the United States and China. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what a quantum computer actually is, and why it needs a home so different from anything we have built before. A classical computer, the kind sitting in your pocket or under your desk, processes information as bits, ones and zeros, on or off. A quantum computer processes information as qubits, which can exist in multiple states simultaneously through a property called superposition, and which can be linked together across distance through a stranger property still, called entanglement. This is not science fiction flourish. It is measurable, testable physics, and it means that for certain types of problems, a quantum machine can explore an almost unimaginable number of possibilities at once, instead of checking them one at a time the way a classical computer does. The catch is that qubits are unbelievably fragile. Vibration can destroy them, heat can destroy them, even stray electromagnetic noise from a nearby elevator motor can be enough to collapse the delicate quantum state the entire calculation depends on. So building a facility to house these machines is not like building a normal data center. It requires refrigeration systems that cool components to temperatures colder than outer space. It requires acoustic isolation so sensitive that engineers have had to study the vibration patterns of elevators moving equipment between floors. It requires electromagnetic shielding, usually reserved for the most sensitive government and military installations. In other words, a quantum data center is not just a bigger, more advanced version of the buildings we already have. It is closer to an entirely new category of infrastructure. And the country that masters building it at scale gains an advantage that goes far beyond bragging rights. Now here is where the geopolitics comes in, and where this story stops being about physics and starts being about power. China has decided, at the highest levels of its government, that quantum technology is not optional. It is existential. In its newest 5-year plan, covering 2026 through 2030, quantum technology sits at the very top of the list of what Chinese planners call future industries. The sector is expected to define the next era of economic and military strength. It shares that list with biomedical research, nuclear fusion, brain-computer interfaces, artificial intelligence embodied in physical robots, and next-generation telecommunications. But quantum comes first. Beijing has backed that priority with real money. Estimates place Chinese government investment in quantum technology somewhere around $15 to $16 billion, funneled through state-linked funds, university partnerships, and companies that operate less like private startups and more like extensions of national strategy. A newly created National Venture Guidance Fund has allocated more than 120 billion yuan across 3 regional investment vehicles, covering the Beijing-Tianjin-Hebei corridor, the Yangtze River Delta, and the Guangdong-Hong Kong-Macau Greater Bay Area. This is not scattered enthusiasm. This is coordinated industrial policy on a national scale, and the results are showing up in the labs. In May of 2026, researchers at the University of Science and Technology of China published results in the journal Nature for a photonic quantum computer called Jiuzhang 4.0. Photonic systems use particles of light instead of the superconducting circuits many Western companies favor, and one advantage is that they do not require the extreme cooling that other approaches demand. Jiuzhang 4.0 manipulated and measured quantum states across more than 3,000 photons, and on a specific benchmark problem, it performed a calculation faster than the world's most powerful supercomputer by a factor with 54 zeros after it. Numbers that large stop meaning anything intuitive to the human brain, but the underlying point is simple. China is not years behind in quantum hardware. In some approaches, it is setting the pace. That is not the only machine China has fielded. There is Zuchongzhi, a superconducting system following a design philosophy closer to what companies like Google and IBM use. There is Origin Wukong, now in its 4th generation, built by a company called Origin Quantum that recently released what it calls the first publicly downloadable quantum operating system, capable of running on superconducting ion trap and neutral atom hardware alike. And there is Tianyan 504, a 504-qubit superconducting system operated by China Telecom Quantum Group, plugged directly into China's national telecommunications backbone. The cloud platform built around that machine has grown explosively. In late 2024, it had logged around 12 million visits from users in more than 50 countries. By early 2026, that number had nearly tripled, to over 37 million visits from users in more than 60 countries. China is not simply building quantum computers in isolated labs. It is actively exporting access to them, building a global user base, and in doing so, building influence. It helps to understand exactly how different these hardware philosophies are, because the differences are not cosmetic. They shape everything from cost to reliability to how quickly each approach can be scaled into a functioning data center. Superconducting qubits, the approach favored by companies like IBM and Google and by China's Zuchongzhi program, require chilling components to temperatures colder than the vacuum of deep space, using elaborate dilution refrigerators that look more like sculptures than machines. Trapped ion systems, the approach championed by companies like IonQ, use lasers to suspend individual charged atoms in place, trading some of the extreme cooling requirements for extraordinary precision in laser control. Photonic systems, the approach behind China's Jiuzhang line, encode information in particles of light instead of matter, sidestepping the need for deep cryogenic cooling altogether, though at the cost of other engineering headaches around detecting single photons reliably. Neutral atom systems represent yet another emerging path, using tightly focused laser tweezers to arrange atoms into precise patterns. No single approach has definitively won yet, and that uncertainty itself is part of why both nations are hedging their bets across multiple hardware families simultaneously, rather than committing everything to one technical horse in the race. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States is not standing still, though its approach looks fundamentally different in character. Where China's quantum strategy is centralized, state-directed, and folded into a single long-term national plan, the American approach is deliberately decentralized. Instead of one government blueprint, the United States relies on a sprawling and competitive ecosystem. More than 40 private companies, national laboratories, research universities, and the country's dominant cloud computing giants, all pursuing different technical bets simultaneously, often racing against each other as much as against China. This year, the Trump administration committed more than $2 billion directly into 9 American quantum computing firms, a move that sent shockwaves through capital markets. Shares of major American quantum companies surged in the days following the announcement. Rigetti Computing jumped more than 60%. D-Wave climbed roughly 53%. Even IBM, the elder statesman of the industry, gained around 13% in the same window. Interestingly, Chinese quantum stocks rallied too, almost in sympathy, as investors bet that Beijing would respond to Washington's move with an escalation of its own. That is what an arms race looks like in a stock ticker. In June of 2026, the White House went further, issuing a pair of executive orders that formalized quantum as a matter of explicit national strategy. One order directs the federal government to accelerate quantum innovation, commercialization, manufacturing, and national security applications across the board. The companion order is more sobering. It warns that large-scale quantum computers, if they end up in the hands of adversaries, could eventually break the cryptographic systems that protect nearly all digital communication today, from banking transactions to classified government cables. That order set in motion a federal effort to migrate vulnerable systems to what is known as post-quantum cryptography, encryption designed to resist attack even from a future quantum computer, with a firm government deadline attached. There is a specific fear embedded in that policy, one that quantum researchers refer to as harvest now, decrypt later. The idea is that adversaries could be intercepting and storing encrypted American data today, banking on the fact that a sufficiently powerful quantum computer will eventually be able to crack it open, even years after the fact. That threat alone has been enough to reshape cybersecurity policy at the highest levels of the American government. On the infrastructure side specifically, the United States Department of Energy renewed $625 million in funding across 5 national quantum information science research centers, housed at national laboratories, including Brookhaven, Fermilab, Argonne, and Lawrence Berkeley. One of these centers, based at Fermilab and called the Superconducting Quantum Materials and Systems Center, is working specifically on a problem that sounds almost mundane compared to headline-grabbing qubit counts, but which may end up being the actual key to the entire race, figuring out how to physically connect many separate quantum processors together into a single coordinated system. In other words, laying the literal groundwork, in the most physical sense of that phrase, for quantum data centers, as we will eventually come to know them. And real physical facilities are already being built, not just planned on paper. IBM completed a major expansion of its quantum data center in Poughkeepsie, New York, expanding a site the company has operated since opening its first purpose-built quantum facility there. IBM also opened a quantum data center in Ehningen, Germany, a facility with roots stretching back to buildings the company has used for nearly a century, now retrofitted for the exotic requirements of quantum hardware. Colorado recently won more than $40 million in federal grant funding to establish a dedicated quantum computing hub. Illinois has gone even further, committing $500 million to build what it is calling a National Quantum Algorithm Center, positioning the state as a hub for the industry, the same way earlier decades saw states compete for automobile plants or semiconductor fabs. So who is actually ahead? The honest answer, according to most independent analysts who track this closely, is that it depends entirely on which yardstick you use. If you are measuring raw output, patents filed, and academic papers published, China is winning, and it is not particularly close. China accounts for roughly 60% of all global quantum-related patent applications, and it produces more academic research output on the subject than any other country, a pattern researchers say has held steady since 2022. If you are measuring government money spent, China again claims the lead, with public investment estimated at somewhere between $4 and $16 billion depending on the source, compared to a U.S. government commitment researchers place closer to $4 to $7 billion, though that gap has been narrowing fast since this year's funding announcements. China has also shown remarkable speed in one specific area that gets less attention than flashy qubit counts: securing its own supply chain. Facing American export controls that have blacklisted dozens of Chinese quantum firms and research institutions, including some of its most prominent university spin-offs, China has responded by sourcing critical manufacturing equipment from non-American suppliers, most notably from Germany, and by racing toward what officials openly describe as full self-sufficiency in the underlying materials the technology depends on. Chinese state media has already reported achieving mass production of a rare isotope critical to certain quantum computing architectures, a milestone with real supply chain implications that Western analysts are still digesting. But if you shift the measuring stick towards software maturity, error correction, and what industry insiders call the depth of the private sector ecosystem, the picture flips, and the United States still holds a meaningful and, according to most technical assessments, a fairly decisive lead. Error correction in particular is the unglamorous but absolutely critical technical hurdle, standing between today's experimental quantum machines and tomorrow's genuinely useful ones. Qubits are noisy and error-prone by nature, and building reliable systems that can detect and correct those errors in real time, what researchers call fault tolerance, is widely seen as the single biggest bottleneck separating quantum computing's current lab-bound status from real commercial impact. American companies and research institutions currently lead in this specific, unglamorous, and arguably most important category. The United States also benefits from private sector depth in a way that is structurally difficult for China to replicate quickly. Dozens of independent, venture-backed companies pursuing wildly different technical approaches simultaneously, from superconducting circuits to trapped ions to neutral atoms to photonics, means the American ecosystem can absorb failures, pivot fast, and let the strongest technical bets rise organically, rather than betting the house on a single, centrally chosen national strategy. There is also a resource sitting quietly underneath this entire race that rarely makes the headlines, but may end up deciding more than any single qubit breakthrough: electricity. Quantum computers may not require the same raw power draw as the massive artificial intelligence data centers currently reshaping the global energy market, but the broader computing infrastructure surrounding them, the classical hybrid systems, the cooling plants, the cryogenic compressors running around the clock, all of it needs enormous and uninterrupted power. China has a structural advantage here that industry leaders in the United States have openly acknowledged with a mix of respect and concern. China's data center capacity has been growing at roughly 30% annually for the better part of a decade, and by 2030, analysts project the country's total data center capacity will reach 60 gigawatts, nearly double where it stands today. Meanwhile, dozens of proposed data center projects in the United States have been blocked, delayed, or stalled by permitting fights, local opposition, and grid capacity constraints over just the past 2 years. Prominent American technology leaders, including figures at the very top of the artificial intelligence and semiconductor industries, have publicly stated that the limiting factor for the next generation of the advanced computing is not chips anymore. It is electricity. And on that specific front, China currently holds the advantage. None of this means the race is decided. Far from it. Most serious industry forecasts, including analysis from major financial research firms, point to 2028 through 2030 as the real inflection point, the window in which quantum computing is expected to shift from experimental demonstration to genuine revenue-generating commercial advantage. IBM's own head of quantum and high-performance computing research has publicly stated the company believes it will reach true quantum advantage on a real-world problem before the end of 2026, a milestone that, if achieved and independently verified, would represent one of the most significant computing breakthroughs of the decade. Achieving that kind of milestone first, and being able to translate it into practical, deployable infrastructure, is widely expected to trigger a dramatic new wave of investment on both sides of the Pacific, the kind of moment that transforms a slow-building technical race into a full-blown, publicly visible sprint. It is worth pausing here to ask why any of this matters beyond national pride or stock market swings. The answer comes down to what quantum computing actually promises to unlock once the engineering catches up to the theory. Drug discovery is one of the most frequently cited applications, because quantum systems are naturally suited to simulating the behavior of molecules, a problem that scales so explosively for classical computers that even the world's fastest supercomputers struggle with anything beyond fairly simple compounds. Materials science is another, with quantum simulation potentially unlocking new battery chemistries, new superconductors, and new industrial catalysts, far faster than traditional trial and error laboratory methods ever could. Financial modeling, logistics optimization, and climate modeling all show up repeatedly on the list of applications researchers believe quantum computing could meaningfully accelerate. One analysis from a major consulting firm projected the technology could unlock as much as $850 billion in economic value by the year 2040. A projection that, even if it proves optimistic, hints at just how much economic weight is riding on getting this infrastructure right. And then there is the darker application, the one that keeps government officials in both Washington and Beijing awake at night. Cryptography. Much of the encryption protecting global banking, government communications, and military systems today relies on mathematical problems that are, for all practical purposes, impossible for classical computers to solve within any useful time frame. A sufficiently powerful, fault-tolerant quantum computer could, in theory, tear through that same math in a fraction of the time. Researchers estimate that breaking a standard 2048-bit encryption key would require somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 stable, error-corrected logical qubits, a number that remains well beyond what any machine on Earth can currently sustain. But well beyond does not mean impossibly far away. And that uncertainty alone is enough to justify the scale of investment both nations are currently pouring into this race. Whichever country crosses that threshold first will not just win a technical milestone, it will gain the ability, at least temporarily, to read secrets that were never meant to be read. This is why so many analysts have started describing the current moment not as a race to invent the best quantum computer, but as a race to build and govern the infrastructure around it. For years, the public conversation about quantum computing centered almost entirely on qubit counts, as if the story was simply a numbers game. Whichever machine had the most qubits wins. That framing is increasingly seen as outdated. The real contest now is about who can build reliable, scalable systems, who can secure the supply chains that feed them, and who can turn early laboratory breakthroughs into infrastructure that businesses, governments, and militaries can actually depend on. The United States, China, and a determined third player, Europe, are each pursuing distinctly different models to answer that challenge. America is trying to align its innovation ecosystem with security-focused governance and a network of allied nations, treating its partners in Europe and Asia as extensions of its own supply chain. China is pursuing what analysts call vertically integrated technological mobilization, linking industrial policy, state funding, and strategic planning into a single top-down machine designed to move fast and stay coordinated. Europe, lacking the raw capital of either superpower, is leaning instead on regulatory coordination and standards influence, betting that whoever writes the rulebook for how quantum systems interconnect and communicate globally will retain outsized influence even without matching American or Chinese spending dollar for dollar. It is a strategy playing out in real time in places like Munich, where a European quantum computing company has built a data center specifically designed to serve as a template that can be replicated in other countries, an approach built around the idea of quantum sovereignty. The notion that sensitive government and corporate customers may eventually require quantum processing to happen on physical hardware located within their own borders, the same way many countries already require sensitive cloud data to be stored domestically. That single design choice, sovereignty by physical location, could end up shaping where quantum data centers get built across the entire globe over the next decade, regardless of which country holds the raw technical lead at any given moment. There is also a talent dimension to this race that rarely gets the same attention as funding announcements or headline-grabbing benchmark results, but which experienced researchers on both sides consistently describe as the real deciding factor over the long run. Quantum information science demands a rare combination of skills, deep physics knowledge, low-temperature engineering expertise, and increasingly software and algorithm design experience, and there are simply not enough trained specialists in the world to satisfy demand on either side of the Pacific. American universities still attract a large share of the world's top quantum physics graduate students, including many from China itself, though tightening visa policies and rising geopolitical tension have made that pipeline less reliable than it once was. China, meanwhile, has poured resources into building domestic graduate programs and research institutes explicitly designed to reduce its dependence on foreign-trained talent, while also offering aggressive incentives to lure back Chinese-born researchers who built their careers in the United States or Europe. Some American and European quantum researchers have noted, with a mix of professional respect and quiet unease, that regardless of government funding structures or political systems, the country that ultimately attracts and retains the deepest bench of talent and gives that talent the freedom to pursue ambitious, even risky research directions, is likely to hold the advantage that matters most once the current funding surge inevitably slows down. So, after all of this, who is actually winning the race to build the world's quantum data centers? The most accurate answer, frustrating as it might sound, is that it is neither purely a Chinese story nor purely an American one. It is a split decision, and depending on which expert you ask, the emphasis shifts. The United States holds the lead in the categories that ultimately determine whether quantum computing becomes genuinely useful. Software maturity, error correction, and a deep, diverse private sector willing to make risky, independent bets across multiple competing technologies. China holds the lead in categories that determine how fast that usefulness can be scaled and deployed at a national level. Raw investment commitment, coordinated industrial policy, supply chain self-sufficiency, and sheer physical infrastructure capacity, backed by an energy grid expanding fast enough to support it. Neither advantage is permanent. Both nations are watching each other closely, adjusting funding levels and policy in near real time, treating every published research paper and every stock market surge as fresh intelligence about where the rival stands. What is clear is that this is no longer a hypothetical, far-off technology confined to university physics departments and speculative headlines. Real concrete is being poured. Real refrigeration systems are being installed. Real billions of dollars and real hundreds of billions of yuan are being committed, not toward some distant future, but toward physical buildings rising right now in New York, in Illinois, in Colorado, in Hefei, in Munich, and in dozens of other locations, quietly positioning themselves to become the physical backbone of whatever comes after classical computing finally hits its limits. The machines inside those buildings are strange, fragile, extraordinarily expensive, and still, in many ways, experimental. But the infrastructure being built around them right now, this year, in 2026, is not experimental at all. It is a deliberate, well-funded, deeply strategic land grab for what may become the most consequential computing resource of the next 50 years. Whichever side you find yourself rooting for, one thing is worth remembering. The next time a headline mentions a new qubit record or a fresh billion-dollar funding round. The number that matters most may not be the qubit count at all. It may be the square footage of shielded concrete, the megawatts of clean power secured, and the trained engineers standing ready to keep the whole fragile system running through the night. And that, ultimately, is the real story behind the race to build quantum data centers. It was never really about who builds the fastest machine or who claims the flashiest headline about beating a supercomputer by some unimaginably large factor. It is about who controls the physical rooms, the cooling systems, the shielded chambers, and the power grids that will eventually house the technology capable of reshaping medicine, material science, finance, and national security all at once. Right now, both the United States and China are betting enormous sums that the answer to that question will be them. Neither one has won yet, but both are building as if the outcome has already been decided, and the rest of the world is watching closely to see which vision of the future gets poured in concrete first.